Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. We're going to continue back with Ryan here on the theme of the entrepreneur, or rather, what happens when you don't have an entrepreneur. Um, and um, let's see, am I ready? Yeah, okay, good. Other thing I'll say is just that uh, support is modest support is received from a number of people and it adds up. Typical is that people donate $5 a month to support the show, and but enough people do that, it really helps cover some of the costs of running the show, like my insurance bill coming due in a week. But anyway, for the work equipment, the show equipment. So that is gratefully received. That is in the video description. It's a subscribe star that I've got set up. And now let's get right to it. Hello, Ryan.
Hello, how are you doing?
Very good. Okay, so for some reason I'm feeling really like right to the point today. No messing around. If you want to do the hanging out at the pub experience, listen to Unpopular Opinions from 2 days ago, and you can hear the guys just BSing around about nothing in particular. But we're going to get right to it today. And first, this is really sort of a part two, I would say, of talking about the entrepreneur. Ryan sharing with us some of the things he's been learning, and so I'm going to drop part one right now into the chat. And super briefly, in part one, we talked about the entrepreneur. Ryan, give us just capsule definition. What is the role of the entrepreneur?
So, it's a function. So, it's not necessarily a job that you have to be hired for. You can only be an entrepreneur or anything else. It's a function that a person will do in a business or in life or anything else. And what the entrepreneurial function is the predicting of market outcomes, future market outcomes, and the pursuit of profit under uncertainty. So, right. Predicting market outcomes doesn't necessarily mean you're watching like stocks tick and all this other stuff. It could be as simple as guessing, I bet people will want this later and they'll be willing to buy it or trade for it or whatever else. Future, so there's a time element. Entrepreneurship takes time, and because there's time, people have changing tastes. There are different material conditions as time goes on. We can gain or lose or find resources that we didn't know we had or that we previously had. You can have all the technology can change. There's uncertainty, which means that entrepreneurs are in the market of speculating or in the job line of speculating. Things are not guaranteed to go their way, which means that entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial function, whoever inhabits it can be either good and correctly guess things and make an entrepreneurial profit, right. Or they can be bad and they can have an entrepreneurial loss, which means they are losing money because they did not correctly predict what people would want in the future.
So super simple everyday example, and I have experienced this. Suddenly the rain just comes completely crashing down. Nobody saw it coming, and somehow some guy is there with a bunch of umbrellas, and he's like, $5, you got an umbrella, $5, and or alternatively, he's wrong and he spent a bunch of money on umbrellas and they're just sitting there uselessly, right?
Right.
So that's the entrepreneurial function in a super simple example. Okay, so let's go right to the subject of the stream, which is how does a company end up without a king, which is an analogy here for a company without an entrepreneur, which seems like, in a way, okay, define what we even mean by that, because in a way I want to argue with it, right? Because if you are running a company, you are making forecasting decisions. You are right. Engaging in an entrepreneurial function, right? But we do mean something here. So what do we mean when we talk about a company that loses that entrepreneurial function?
Right. So more very brief and punctual summarization of what we discussed last time. Entrepreneurs, in this pursuit of profit by predicting future uncertain conditions, will establish companies or firms. I can't really just really will something into existence and then go see if people want it. I have to actually produce it, and in order to produce it, I need material and know-how and time and all this other stuff. So an entrepreneur will establish a firm.
Right.
And there are different functions as a result of the entrepreneur establishing this firm that can be inhabited by that person or more people. So you can have the technician, which is responsible for making very micro adjustments to the production process and to the firm itself to make sure that it's working as well as it can. You can have a couple of other things, but there's also the manager, which means that when the firm gets so large, the entrepreneur cannot be in every place at once. He must hire out part of his duties to someone else in order to manage that part of the firm like a fiefdom, basically. So
Right.
entrepreneur says, I can't be in both of these plants at once if it's a big enough firm or whatever. You're going to be in charge of that one. You're going to report back to me, and you're going to run it as I would or better.
Yeah, and so you're saying that my choice here in the imagery and title of the stream of a king is not completely a crazy analogy, because if you picture the medieval king who is over lords, and the lords are in turn over, I don't know my medieval hierarchy, on and on down. You could think of the king as the entrepreneur, the lords as the C-suite or something, right? The chief officers, who in turn delegate to others, to other middle managers and so forth, right?
If they need to, right?
If needed, yeah.
These all have to turn profits,
Right.
which is a very key thing in what we're going to be discussing. Because the way this is supposed to work is if the entrepreneur appoints a manager and that manager no longer turns a profit, you sack the manager and then you get a better one, or do it yourself if you can do it better. So it's all profit-oriented. Why is it profit-oriented? Because you earn a profit by providing what people want. If you are earning a loss, you are not providing what people want. It's that simple. So if you take a loss by appointing a manager, they're doing something wrong in terms of your consumers. It is profitable to sack them to better satisfy consumers, better earn an entrepreneurial profit. So in the modern world, it doesn't take a genius to look at the shelves, look at the social propaganda coming out of most companies, and see that they aren't really providing what people want.
They're not consumer oriented.
Right. So, and you can see this very clearly. I'm sure you could get into very extreme details, and well, it's not really as it says, and all this other stuff. But for most firms, if there's even a boycott campaign against you by someone, usually that's a bad sign, because you're trying to serve the most people possible to get as much of a profit as you can. In theory, that should lead to some form of neutrality. You don't have to promote some sort of social message with your product. You just have to provide a product that people want. We don't see that in the modern day. We see suddenly all the brand colors turn rainbow in the month of June, which in turn alienates half the population, and even probably some of the owners, if some pundits are to be believed, which is quite a big if.
Some of the owners, you mean stockholders?
Right. So
People
who have an entrepreneurial interest, these companies will go against them sometimes.
Right.
So you see that, and then you also see a whole bunch of other activities that are just outside the scope of the firm. Why does it matter if Coca-Cola has some giant environmental money sink to get the environmental credit if it's not making them money? If it's not turning a profit, then not enough people want it. It doesn't make sense unless it's for some sort of psychic profit, which even then, it doesn't seem like it's that for half the company, because I don't know many people that just absolutely love these initiatives. Maybe you do. You're closer to that sphere than I am, but none of it makes sense if you take this pristine theory that we've laid out here in the last episode. So something has to have changed, or we're wrong. And I would argue we're not wrong, something has changed. And it's that these firms that you see in the modern day, the sort of modern business world, is not being driven by entrepreneurs, which sounds like it's self-defeating, because we already said entrepreneurs are the people who direct the firms by definition.
Right.
Well, they own them and they organize them, but we have not talked about what if they just step away, what if they become passive, what if they don't sack the manager whenever the manager starts turning a profit. well, then we start seeing the modern business climate that we are so accustomed to today. Um, and this process was very nicely laid out by someone that many of our audience should be familiar with, James Burnham, and his Managerial Revolution. And summary on a very dense book is that he takes a sort of a, I don't want to call it this as a slur, but just you see it in a lot of Marxist historiography. He starts out with feudal era in Western society, which developed into the capitalist era, where then the capitalists were the main power class. And then he says that after the capitalists and the entrepreneurs in Western society, you get the managers who have taken over, and now they are the main power-wielding class. And Burnham says this is only possible if the state effectively owns the major instruments of production. And he says within this framework, there will be no direct property rights in the major instruments of production vested in individuals as individuals. So it's all for managers, the amorphous blob of people who are supposed to direct everything and micromanage production numbers and all this other stuff.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting what a radical proposition Burnham is putting forward, and it feels like it seems so radical when you think it through. It seems like crazy, like he can't be right? Because what he basically says is, look at the Soviet Union, where there's a central plan set by the government, and the people who manage, the factories and businesses and so forth, are just ultimately taking orders from the central plan, right? So they're not entrepreneurs in the sense that we just defined. They are literally just, ordering things according to a higher direction,
Right.
which is not an entrepreneurial direction. It's a state, it's a political direction, right? And therefore, in the Soviet economy, essentially, we expect that there really is no place for the entrepreneur. There are only managers, ultimately subject to the Central Coordinating Economic Planning Committee or something like that.
Managers that don't turn profit.
Yeah, the managers that don't turn profit, right? So what he says, so you follow so far, right? We believe this, probably, this description of the Soviet Union. What he says is the United States is no different, effectively. That sounds pretty nuts, right? Because it's like, well, wait a second. We don't have a central, economic planning commission or whatever that's telling all the companies what to do. And so, yeah, help us believe Burnham a little bit.
Right. So he lays out there's a sort of, I don't know if he calls it an ideology, he might call it that, but a sort of umbrella group of ideals that arose in the 20th century, which can be described as managerial. And the point of these managerial ideologies is, well, they develop because of state ownership of the means of production, which have to be handed out basically to managers, people who have the technical, according to, this is Burnham's definition of the manager, and we'll get into all that later. Burnham says that the managers are the people that have the skills and abilities to coordinate people in the production process, which is pretty colloquial. If you were to ask someone what a manager is, that's probably what they would tell you. So it's not the worst definition he's going with here, but it relates it to the means of production, which is a very Marxist underpinning that you'll find throughout this book. And he'll say, in these managerial ideologies, you basically hand out the means of productions to managers. They don't own them, they just manage them. So if you were to talk about ownership effectively, like who is using this all the time and who is taking it in whatever direction, it's managers. Though de jure, it's basically the state. And he says these managerial ideologies would be the National Socialist regime and the fascist regime in Central Europe. It would also be the Marxist-Leninist regime in Bolshevik Russia. You can kind of see how that's true because in both of those, or all three of those states, I should say, the state would nationalize industries and hand them out to who the state decided would be the best managers. They had different ways that they would set production quotas and different ways that they would set trajectories, but same thing here. They both fit the definition of managerialism. But he also...
bringing up Germany, mid-century the German regime is maybe helpful here in helping us bridge over to understanding how Burnham could put the United States in the same bucket as these other systems. in terms of how the economy works. Because what Mises said, and he was right in the middle of it all. What
Right.
Mises said is he said Russia and Germany are both doing socialism. In Russia, they explicitly assign ownership. They de jure, right? They
Right.
officially assign ownership to the state. Okay. He says in Germany, he called it socialism in the Russian style and socialism in the German style.
Right.
In socialism in the German style, they don't officially do that. They say, "Oh, well, that would be Bolshevism. We're anti-communist. We wouldn't do that." So they leave things in the control of Faber or whatever, the industrialist. But here's the catch, Mises says. They tell him what to do.
Right.
So his name is on the ownership papers. But in terms of the directing production, it's still the government directing production in Nationalist Socialist Germany, according
Right.
to political ends, right?
Right, and that's exactly it. And this, you're right, that is a very good bridge because, he's basically listing off ideologies here. Technocracy, he says, is a managerialist philosophy. Any person here who has listened to Morgoth's review would know exactly why that would be the case, because technocracy was one of the things that he was quite heavily harping on, I believe, probably a year and a half ago now. If he isn't still doing it every now and then.
He keeps on that beat, yeah.
So technocracy, that's an American system. If you were to look at the history of it, you'll find a official symbol for it and everything. It was an American ideology to begin with. Maybe also British. I'm sure there was Anglosphere overlap. But then he would apply it to the New Deal regime and the way that the American state was handling things up until, and I believe this would have been written in the 40s, 50s, give or take, if I remember correctly. The time written doesn't matter because we've been living in the New Deal state ever since then. But this is sort of he's predicting a lot here because the New Deal state did not overtly nationalize very many industries at all. And it was sort of marketed as a new way of welfare to lift people out of poverty, to help solve the Great Depression, to help ease the burdens and all this other stuff. And they were not going to do what the National Socialists and the Bolsheviks were doing. Rather, the New Deal was going to keep the liberal system that we have. They were just going to make things better for everyone. And in doing so, they have how are you going to do this massive expansion of the welfare state that you saw in the New Deal regime? Well, you're going to have managers, people who can accurately and precisely organize material and people in these production processes, distribution, planning, and coordination across the country, in the university systems and all these other things that were expanded during the time. You're going to need managers. Businesses would go along with this as well. The New Deal regime was very corporatist. What you saw was a lot of companies were told to either go along or get lost. Get lost meaning they would in some way be harmed by the government. FDR and Truman were both very explicit about that. They would just directly threaten private industries. So you would see this sort of public-private collaboration. That would in turn mean that now private industries would need managers for all of these different initiatives, which they weren't doing beforehand. To summarize all of it, basically. And Burnham says here that this isn't going to be a private ownership of the means of production in any sense, because no private interest is effectively controlling anything here. It's all coming from the New Deal regime. And for anyone that's wondering how he can say all of this, Burnham worked in the New Deal administration. So
Right.
he saw it from the inside. And in fact,
the book came out right around 41 or something, isn't that right?
That sounds right. And
yeah.
So
this is right in the heart of, when is
1941. So
when is FDR elected?
FDR first elected, I believe that'd be 1932.
32, yeah. So he's writing this or publishing this about 8 years into the world, life under FDR. So he's in the thick of this. And I wanted to mention, Ryan, previously on the show, people may not, it's hard for us to understand because, of course, as usual, our history books don't tell us what we need to know. It's hard to understand how radical the New Deal was. It's hard to remember because we don't, they don't make a bunch of movies about how terrible the FDR regime was because they liked FDR, right?
Right.
But Robert Higgs, my friend Robert Higgs, wrote a paper on this. We went through that. I don't know if I can pull it up and share it, but I'll try our stream on it. But he did a paper on this where he demonstrated that businessmen at the time perceived FDR's New Deal as quite radical. And he demonstrated it in at least two ways. One is that they said it. He gave lots of examples that they were freaked out. They were really concerned about where is this going? Is he just going to expropriate everything? The other, so that's stated. I'm sorry, what is our revealed preference versus stated preference? Right. That's the stated preference. But he also, and this is really the breakthrough with Higgs' research there, he also showed that through revealed preference, businessmen demonstrated that they lacked confidence in this being an ongoing market system because they stopped investing.
Right.
They stopped investing under FDR. They put their money where their mouth was. They said, we do not trust that he's not going to just, seize our companies, or what in fact was happening, just essentially tell us what to do with our companies so that we can't actually, run them in a profitable manner. And so they just stopped putting money. Private investment dropped through the floor. It stayed there until like FDR died. Okay.
Right.
So I'll try to find that stream real quick while Ryan talks. But if you're unfamiliar with that aspect of that history of our country, which was a long time, by the way, 32 to 45, I think. Mm-hmm. 13 years and 13 pretty crazy radical
Not
years.
counting Truman, who continued it into the 50s. Right.
There you go. Yeah. So 13, nearly 20 years. We live with many of the ongoing effects of this. It's not like the New Deal got 100% rolled back. If it did, who did it? Name me the presidential administration that was like, okay, we are completely rolling back the New Deal.
Yeah, we're going.
Who was that? No one did it.
Yeah, no one's going to get rid of the FSLA or all these other things. No one's going to get rid of all the different agricultural administrations and all this other stuff. Now, there is something to be said. The Austrians will correctly tell you that most of the New Deal ideas started under Hoover. If you want to read into that, there's Rothbard's America's Great Depression.
Yeah. But that's right. We're not. So we could even stretch it before FDR. Right. So you've got a long period of going into this. Yeah.
Right. So, in fact, Rothbard he doesn't have kind words for Burnham, because Rothbard knew about Burnham's history as well. He knew that he was a Trotskyite turned conservative, basically. And in
he tended to be suspicious of such people.
Well, in one of his essays, it's not that he's suspicious. He says that Burnham, in order to salvage his wasted time as a Trotskyite, basically made a bigger deal out of the Marxists than Rothbard at the time thought was an issue, which I don't necessarily agree with Rothbard there, but I did find that interesting when I was doing research for this. But so this was 1941, published in 1941, and Burnham has this quote here, which I think is very interesting. He says, but during the past several decades, the de facto management of the instruments of production has, to a constantly increasing extent, got out of the hands of the capitalists. And to Burnham, capitalists is what we've been calling entrepreneurs. We'll get into that in a second. And he continues, in ever-widening sectors of the world economy, the actual managers are not the capitalists. Or, at the very least, the managerial prerogatives of the capitalists are being progressively whittled down. So this is 1941. Burnham's talking about the world here, including the United States, the UK, France, the world. And he's saying that in every single part of the world, wherever capitalists have held the control over the means of production, or the instruments of production, their prerogative is being progressively whittled down. And he'll expand on this in the book. If you read it, this is 74 pages in, so it's not the very beginning, but also not the end. I believe it's probably the fourth chapter, maybe, if I remember correctly. It's early on. And he'll expand upon this into predictions. As the capitalists have their prerogative whittled down, eventually managers will become the dominant social force in the country. The state will require them because the state is now managerial, so everything the state does will require managers. The state will exert its influence on companies, making them managerial, which will require managers. Academia as well will have to teach the managers and all this other stuff. You'll get the cycle that increasingly perpetuates managerialism. So this is what Burnham wrote in 1941. What I just read for you there, and that's all that we really need for this purpose, anyways. When we're talking about the modern economy, most of Burnham's predictions came true. If you want to read through it, it's a very good book, but I would say, as should any Austrian at the very least, it does have a few problems because he's.
Okay, wait a second,
Okay,
just real
right.
quick. I found this and I wanted to drop it in. I'm proud of the title when we talked about life under the new business under the New Deal. The title is "The Economy Under Anarcho-Tyranny." I'm dropping that in the live chat right now, and that's where we discuss the economy under the New Deal. Robert Higgs' important paper showing how private investment just dropped off because basically they could see that managerialism or bureaucratization or government control, whatever term you prefer, it was being put in hard during those years. So they just stopped investing.
Right, which you'd expect.
Yeah.
And that goes perfectly in hand with what Burnham is saying here. If people aren't investing anymore, but somehow the industry is, at least by the state's terms, growing, it's not private. you need private investment for production, which is why people invest and save to begin with, is so that you can produce more later. You can improve your well-being. If you do not have private investments, you're not having private production. It's going to be done by the state, which is Burnham's prediction here. Now, the point that I was going on to, and this is basically the subject of my paper that I presented in March at the Mises Institute, which you and a few other people were present for. Burnham is good. He makes a lot of correct predictions, but I would say that he sort of limits himself because he's using a very Marxist lens when he's interpreting things, despite the fact that when he wrote this, he was not a Marxist. So when he's talking about the capitalist class, the managerial class, and then in the book as well, he contrasts it with the feudal class. This is a Marxist historiography, nothing inherently wrong with it for what he's doing. But he does pull I don't want to call it a trick because that assigns some sort of malice to Burnham, but he pulls a sort of rhetorical device, I would say, in his book where he says we're going to define these the different players in the economy at this point in time by their function in their relation to the instruments of production. Well, if you're going to define the economy by production, it doesn't quite make sense because you need to know why there's production to begin with, which would require an understanding of the entrepreneur. So if you wanted to contrast this, the Austrians have an economy theory of the economy, or have an entrepreneurial theory of the economy. The Marxists have a production theory of the economy, as do the neoclassicals and all these other people, if you want a short summary. So all of Burnham's functional definitions of these social classes hinge on the instruments of production and who's owning them. So whenever he would talk about, if he would talk about the Gilded Age, as it's commonly called in the contemporary historiography, the age of robber barons and all these other types, which we can go into how accurate that is, he would say that this was the capitalist class. Why is it the capitalist class? Because they are private interests owning the means of production. And then before them, you would have the feudal class, which owned the instruments of production, which relied on a system of honor, fiefdoms, contracts for land ownership, and all this other stuff. So that's his historiography, and he's saying this gives way to the new social class, the managers, which are not private interests. They are a social class that are focused on coordination of production. They have interests tied into the states of the world, into all these different ideologies. There's a problem with this, in that if you have a proper understanding of the economy, the social classes in relation to the means of production are not what you would go with to describe what's happening. You would talk about the entrepreneur. Who is directing these things to begin with, and why did he disappear, at least according to Burnham. So when Burnham's talking about the capitalists, we can instead fit this into a sort of Misesian framework. We can take Burnham's thesis still and keep it intact. We have entrepreneurs who run companies who were especially dominant in society, but also in the economy, in that Gilded Age. So if you were to ask who owned and operated Bethlehem Steel, Standard Oil, all these other things, you would immediately know who the founder was and who the entrepreneur was. They were synonymous. Same thing with U.S. Steel or Carnegie Steel.
Ford, as we like to bring up.
The Ford Motor Company, the Hershey chocolatiering company, and all this other stuff.
And in more recent times, you have like Steve Jobs running Apple, right?
Right, or entrepreneurially running it. Yeah. So you have all of these different entrepreneurs that you once saw dominant in most Western societies, but you don't really see them around so much in the 40s when Burnham's writing this, or even in the 30s. You don't see them around as much today. If you were to ask who is the entrepreneur who founded any like major tech company, most people probably today wouldn't be able to tell you if you were to just pick them off the side of the street. They would have definitely known who operated Standard Oil in the year 1890, the average person. Average person, I would bet, probably doesn't know who was the real driving force behind, like, Twitter or something like that, who really founded it. They could probably tell you maybe Dorsey's the CEO, or one of the major forces. Google, same thing. Most of these tech companies, you know who the CEO is. Most people knew who the CEO of YouTube was. Facebook, founders, maybe Facebook is the exception there, but it's an exception. So something has happened. Burnham is still right here, even if we do take this entrepreneurial framework for what we're viewing the economy with, he's still right. The entrepreneurs have receded in their social power, the people inhabiting its functions. So what happened? Well, Burnham is still correct in his saying that state intervention caused this. If you look at starting a business and operating it 150 years ago, there is a lot less state intervention than there is now. In fact, if you were to try to operate some sort of major enterprise, God forbid internationally, you would have to have a whole host of attorneys, a whole host of managers, and all this other stuff to make sure that you didn't violate some law in some locality that was instituted because of federal regulations and all this other stuff. It would be nearly impossible to have a Standard Oil today in the way that Standard Oil came about in the 1860s, 70s, I forget when.
I can't help but think of some of the recent things I've noticed. I think this was in regards to Twitter, where the some bureaucrat in the European Union is like tweeting, saying, you're going to have to behave or we will shut you down, Musk. Like, man, can you imagine Rockefeller having to deal with that kind of crap?
Like, they still did deal with state intervention. It's just you didn't have to have an HR department. You did not have to abide by all of these different labor standards acts. You didn't have to abide by all these interstate commerce regulations, right? Et cetera, yeah. And then you also didn't have to deal with these other things that we'll get into. You didn't have to deal with these social pushes which have the endorsement of state governments, like stakeholder capitalism from the WEF. You didn't have to deal with all these social credit scores under the guise of ESG and whatever else. So times have changed. Burnham's thesis is still basically correct here. De facto, there is no entrepreneurial ownership of their company. It's so micromanaged by all these different laws and regulations that it might as well be state regulation or state ownership. When all the Austrians, populists, and traditionalists were saying that like Coca-Cola and Walmart and all these other places were just arms of the state, when they push all these different social messages, they coat themselves in rainbows come June, they issue statements about BLM and all this other stuff whenever the riots happen. They aren't doing that because there's an entrepreneurial profit to be made there necessarily. They're doing it because this is what all these social programs and state organized programs are telling them to do, at least to somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
And then
legal decisions, yeah.
Right, so I'm slightly jumping ahead there, but to finish that line of reasoning, most people don't even have to know that this all started with some sort of intervention and regulation, either by NGOs or governments. Most people can probably just learn this at this point in managerial philosophy and academia, things that get pushed in the business schools where you would hire these managers from since they are now necessary. Most people who think and probably get awarded for being good managers are pushing new philosophies that have only been around for like 20 years or so, that talk about how you need to be socially conscious, you need to be focusing on environmental and social governance, you need to be focusing on all of these different initiatives. You need to make sure that you have stakeholder scope in what you're doing.
I was going to say stakeholder instead of shareholder orientation.
Right. So, and for people that don't know the sort of mumbo jumbo there, stakeholder capitalism means that companies have to focus on everyone whenever they do anything, not prices, profits, and all these other things like a sane economy would focus on to tell you to do something or not to do something. They have to focus on people who would be impacted by their products. They have to focus on people who are impacted by the people they employ and all this other stuff. It's expanding the influence of a firm like 80 degrees outward and then pinning anything that goes wrong on the firm.
Right.
Which is absolutely insane, as opposed to shareholder ownership, which you can get into the merits of that, but it is literally saying these people own the company, and we have whoever's managing the company has an interest in providing profits for these owners, which means you follow profits, prices, and whatever else like a normal company would in any other time and place. So this is something that's come about. That stakeholder stuff is pushed in academia. At this point, it's in undergraduate level courses. I'm sure if you were to take some sort of high school class on any sort of economics, you would find it there at this point. So you don't even have to necessarily get an edict from Washington or from London or Paris or wherever else saying, do this or we're going to nationalize your company. You just hire a manager who looks good on your resume, which hiring processes are already so regulated that it's not really organic anymore. Mm-hmm. You just hire a manager that looks good enough, and they're going to do this anyways because it's all that they've been taught. Right. So,
have you been exposed to some of this in your education so far?
So for my business administration degree of economics and entrepreneurship, I have to take all of the introductory core classes for each of the different business disciplines. Right. So I had to take Introduction to Management this last semester. And we spent probably a few weeks on stakeholder and environmental stuff, concerns. We spent probably a bunch of time on psychology and sociology and all these different things, which is a precursor to a lot of this. If you look at the old sociological and psychological studies that they tried to use for businesses, some of which didn't even originate in the business climates, it's just been co-opted. You'll find a lot of it has its place in these philosophies. So you have all these different theories about motivating employees and all this other stuff, which would be very familiar to anyone who has to be in business academia. And all of them focus on basically tertiary awards that are outside of a normal business. So are you providing enough social cause support in order to motivate your employees and all this other stuff? So stuff like that. None of this stuff would be organic if you were to have it on a free and open market, but it's what we have. Burnham's thesis, I would say, under this new entrepreneurially grounded framework is correct still. We had a Lumberg, our guy in the chat, said that must have been brain-numbing. Believe me, it was. Because I was writing this while I was having to take all of that. So, we'll get into actually where we differ here with Burnham by changing this framework over to an Austrian one. So, the closest definition of manager that you can find in Burnham, and this is an issue in Mises as well, you can't really find manager, and then a definition after it. They aren't that direct. So Burnham says, the manager, or here's the quote, tasks of the technical direction and coordination of the process of production. These tasks must be coordinated so that different materials, tools, machines, plants, and workers are all available at the proper place and moment and in the proper number. This task of direction and coordination is itself a highly specialized function which requires a manager. And then he would clarify this later. He says certain individuals, the operating executives, production managers, plant superintendents, and their associates have charge of all of the actual technical processes of production. It is their job to organize the materials, tools, machines, plant facilities, equipment, and labor. These are individuals whom I call the managers. So, seems very practical, but like we said at the beginning, he's focusing on production, who owns and operates the means of production. I don't see any reason to really keep that. if we were to use an Austrian interpretation of this, and we'll get into why you would change this framework later. In human action, Mises would call most of that the technician. Technicians to Mises are people who have the ability and the skill to perform definite kinds and qualities of work, and who also attend to constant and large and small adjustments in an enterprise. So, what that definition was there, that was from Mises describing a technician. Sounds kind of like what Burnham was saying managers were. So he's kind of, I would say he's broadened his scope there. Most of the people that Burnham would just rattled off when he was talking about plant supervisors, production managers, executives and associates, and all these other types, different squad leaders and whatever else you want to call them. I would say most of these people aren't really responsible for this whittling away of basically property rights from the capitalists. They aren't really taking away the prerogative. Instead, they're just doing what they would normally do under anybody, which is follow orders to do things well and make sure that these things are done in an efficient manner. That's not really what's changed here. People have always done that. You've always hired out people to be that technician, which is why when we take Mises's definition of a manager, which he says is a junior partner of the entrepreneur, and whose only directive is to make as much profit as possible when put in charge of a specific section of an enterprise. When we use that instead, this is what's changed. It's not that we suddenly just have more, the technology requires managerialism, we just have to have more people focused on small and large adjustments to production, and that's why the capitalist prerogative has gone away. I would say that that's wrong in that limited sense. Rather, what we see here is that managers are no longer the junior partner of the entrepreneur, at least in practice. These managers who are supposed to make as much profit as possible in sections of an enterprise are not making profit. That is not their primary concern. They won't be sacked if they turn a loss. And they're not really a junior partner if they are calling all of the shots and the entrepreneur is passively standing by. On paper, sure, the entrepreneur still is over the manager. They could, if they wanted to, sack these people with following proper regulations and whatnot. They just don't. For whatever reason, and we'll get into why.
The problem is, who do they replace them with? I mean, they just get another manager, right?
Well, right, but even then you could still solve that. It's just, eventually you could solve that. It's just we aren't. Most entrepreneurs aren't sacking these people if they turn a loss. All these managers are focusing on things that are not profit. So I would say if we can separate these two definitions of technician and manager that we found sort of combined in Burnham's thesis, then we can actually get into what's really changed, and we can kind of expand what he's talking about into the modern day. So it's no longer just predictions that have come true, but we can use this new framework and Burnham's thesis, modified into this framework, sort of to explain what's going on right now and make our own predictions. So we drop this technician element from Burnham's definition of the manager, and we bring a lot of clarity. So, what Burnham's talking about when he's defined manager now, and we've redefined it to be a little bit cleaner, and he's saying that what he's describing is not occupational bias. It's not the age-old problem of, well, managers and entrepreneurs have different incentives. So a manager is going to have incentives to make as much profit right now, and it might hurt the long term of the company. And this has been a subject of business theory for quite a long time, probably over 100 years now. How do you solve the difference of incentives between managers and entrepreneurs? That's not really our case, and neither is Burnham's, because he directly says this isn't what he's talking about. He's not saying that incentives have just so aligned that managers are ruining companies and the entrepreneurs have just ignored this. Burnham's talking about something much more foundational here, and that managers have basically their own ideology, if you will. Managers propagate, according to Burnham, different attitudes, habits of thought, ideals, and ways of methods in solving problems, which is a bit more than the old occupational bias problem. This is ideological, which is why at the beginning when we were saying you can have managerial ideologies, so you can have National Socialism, Bolshevism, New Dealism, technocracy. This is why. Managers don't necessarily have to know that they're ideologues, but that's what they effectively are, which is why when you now take an Introduction to Management course, you can have all like half the semester dedicated to psychology and sociology, different social ways to organize people, not to increase profit or better that part of the company, but to make sure you're motivating people and getting them behind a cause, as if that's what a firm is supposed to provide. So that's just management theory. Burnham's calling it out here in 1941.
I'm almost tempted to call it like the managers are supposed to take on almost a quasi-religious function or something, right?
Right, that's exactly what it is.
That is to propagate the faith, the faith of diversity, or stakeholder capitalism, or these are well beyond the technician, right?
Right.
Of just, hey, let's produce our widgets more efficiently or whatever. No, we've got to get everybody believing the same thing, right?
Right, and that's so. I remember they'll talk about mission and vision statements and ethical statements and all this other stuff as distinct categories in management classes. Most of those things will be good in a company. So like it would make sense. You could see on a free market why a company would tell people, we're going to do this grand thing, because that will get people interested in buying the product. But what managers will do is they'll take those mission and vision statements and ethical statements and whatever else, and they will push it from the top down onto the employees like a social commissar, which is why you can get called into an HR room if you go against, if you misgender someone or whatever else, because on top of making the workplace unsafe for these people, it goes against our ethical standards as a company, and we can't have that in our employee management, or our employee, in whatever department you're in. So,
you would think that if you knew nothing about what had happened since Burnham's time and probably before, you would think that you'd get in trouble as a manager for bad business decisions, right? Like inefficient, not producing well, not doing your job well in the sort of the classical sense.
Right.
And I assume that still happens, but now there's a whole new set of reasons for which you can get in trouble, because you have gone against ideological orthodoxy in some way, right?
Right, exactly. And as you were saying, that classical sense could have been useful. I'm not saying it's necessarily good practice or desirable for companies to time how long it takes you to walk from this place to this place, like you saw in scientific management. But the whole point of that potentially misguided theory of management was, as a manager, you're supposed to turn a profit. How do you turn a profit? You make your production as low cost and efficient as possible. That's an Austrian idea. Managers keep costs down because it's what the entrepreneur chooses when he starts a venture. You have no clue what profits you're going to make, so your costs have to be as low as possible while still producing what people want. Modern management will not do that. Modern management will talk about motivations, retaining employees, and all this other stuff as if they are ends in and of themselves. They will not mention profit. Profit is a dirty word. So when these managers aren't focused on profit, you're not going to turn a profit, it turns out. So this new breed of manager isn't really going to make much money in the traditional sense. I'm sure you could get different grants and loans and subsidies from different initiatives, NGOs, governments, and whatnot to keep you afloat. So you could turn money in that sense. But you're not doing business at this point. Now it's just a political game. You're not providing things that people want and turning a profit as a result because they valued what you provided more than the money they were giving you. Now you are, in theory, producing something, and an NGO or a foundation or a state has decided that having this thing on the shelves is really important, so we're going to throw money at you. So you're not turning what we would traditionally call a profit in this sense. So you're not doing business. You're playing patronage with the government and with NGOs and all these different foundations, which also means that managers really aren't going to be fired for not turning a profit, because half the time now they aren't even being hired to turn a profit. They're being hired to manage in the new managerial sense. So if you're not going to fire these managers for turning a loss, what's going to happen is these managers are going to prioritize political and social causes or their own personal causes above the profit of the company, profitability of the company. This might sound fine to a traditionalist. We might have a few traditionalists in the audience. They'll say that's good. These companies should be in line with people or the heritage or whatever else. It's not that, but in theory, you can go along with that. It's just your company's going to have to be propped up, and you're no longer doing business. In terms of business, in terms of the economy and what people are buying and trading, you see a lot of companies no longer be companies, and they just turn into these political machines who happen to produce things and put things onto supermarket shelves. This isn't sustainable, because if you are relying on money from all these different groups and organizations, from an inflated stock price due to ESG scores or whatever else, you're eventually going to literally run out of resources. This is a calculation problem in a distorted sense. It's not that we've done away with prices. It's that for whatever reason we have decided to completely ignore prices, which is what the loss is supposed to tell you. When you're doing business and you turn a loss, you're no longer supposed to do what you just did. People didn't want what you provided. So if you have a company or a government that comes in, or an NGO or whatever else, and they start subsidizing you for turning this loss because of a social cause, you are going to run out of resources eventually. It's going to pop. The whole structure is going to come falling down. So when this all comes back to, entrepreneurs are not firing these managers for turning a loss. They're instead allowing managers to place these political and social functions over a profit. If you could talk for a moment, I think my voice might be wavering.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking about the economic calculation thing. It's like, why do we care so much about companies continuing to keep a focus on the bottom line, on prices, on costs? And that's because aiming for profit and paying attention when you're making a loss is how a company coordinates with the rest of the economy. Prices are part of an amazing system that no one designed, that no human designed at least, that is how an economy works. So I have covered this before on the show, Mises's paper, and I'm going to drop it in the chat now. My title might be a little confusing. It's called "By and Large is Impossible," because I wanted to emphasize that the economic calculation argument doesn't just cut against sort of a classic socialist model, socialism in the Russian style where the state takes over everything. It cuts against this idea that a few firms are going to gobble up all the other firms, and like in the movie WALL-E, they'll just be by and large, and that's it. They'll just be one big firm that owns everything. Mises's paper demonstrates to us that they would never be able to function in a rational way. They wouldn't have market prices. They wouldn't be able to calculate profit and loss, and so they wouldn't be able to use resources in an efficient way. And they would be like all those stories we heard about the Soviet Union, right? Where they produced too many nails, or a few nails that were too big, or, all these horror stories you hear from the Soviet Union, where they did what to us seems like comical economic decisions. I think where Ryan's trying to bring us here is to see that those comical economic decisions we laughed about with the Soviet Union are happening right now all around us under our current heavily state intervention managerialist regime. Right.
And once again, that should be a concern for everyone, because if you make irrational economic decisions, like decisions made without economic calculation, you're going to use up resources that shouldn't have been used up. People are going to go without what they want or need, and you're going to cause a lot of damage. One of the major examples from the managerial regime in Soviet Russia, the Bolsheviks, would be the drying up of the Aral Sea, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
If they did not have this managerialist regime, that sea would still be there. Just one example, you could point to the millions of deaths that were caused by trying to centrally manage farming.
Agriculture,
So that's one example. I'm sure you could probably find other examples elsewhere. We could probably find a slew of them for the United States after the New Deal regime. Since it's been going on, it was not ended like the other two. But just so that people know what I'm drawing from, human action, whenever we're talking about firing a manager if he doesn't turn a profit, Mises says the only directive he gives to a man whom he entrusts with the management of a circumscribed job is to make as much profit as possible. If he incurs losses, he will be replaced by a man whom the entrepreneur expects to be more successful, or the whole section will be discontinued. If he succeeds in making profits, his income will be increased, or at least he will not be in danger of losing it. So, that's the classic incentives for having a manager to turn a profit in an area, and this all relies on firing the guy or discontinuing that branch of the industry if the profit's impossible or not being turned, which is how you get managers placing, in the modern day, placing social and political causes above profit. It's because they're not fired and their wings aren't discontinued within a business. So that's the difference that we've made here. Now that we've done away with the sort of Marxist definitions inherent to Burnham, we can point to, well, why is this happening? Managers aren't being fired, and then we can go to why aren't they being fired? Well, it's state intervention. So this is the mechanism, which I'm sure many people can kind of see how you can apply this to right now, because we have a whole slew of examples of companies downsizing, but we'll get there in a second. Because we've talked about governments need these managers now because of the way that they operate, and they influence private businesses, which will make these businesses managerial. So this would explain why we have DIE or DEI initiatives within private businesses. No one asked for it. I bet you that 95% of the people that go to the supermarket do not check what bread they're buying to make sure that the company has a DEI apartment of sufficient stature. I bet you they just see what bread is best suited for them, and then they purchase it. Same thing with any other thing in the store. The whole reason that these private ventures that are founded on these more liberal social causes in the last 20 years, the reason that they don't stay private for long, or that they're so expensive that they don't get a massive market by them, is because no one really wants it. If they did want it, they'd be willing to spend more. You would see more production then on the part of the entrepreneur starting it, and you would just see it develop naturally. Instead, we have state-imposed, diversity requirements and all this other stuff within private organizations. So that's how we get all of it. This is sort of like the modern ramifications of managerialism, is this everything that anyone on the actual right keeps railing against, these sort of anti-white diversity initiatives and whatever else, is not normal. It's not normal free market operations. It's state-induced managerialism. Same thing with the gay pride stuff. 20 years ago, if you were to tell someone that every single corporation in the country would, for 1 month out of the year, support homosexuality as much as possible to the point where they would rebrand their logos to be rainbow-colored, they would have all their products be rainbow-colored and whatever else, they would put out all these messages in support, they would laugh at you, because 20 years ago at this point in time, I think this was still at this point right now, 20 years ago, there were still sodomy laws on the books in like 11 states or so that could be enforced. That was before Lawrence v. Texas, so or Texas v. Lawrence, I forget which way around. So this is how far we've come in 20 years. This is not an organic development. People did not just suddenly decide in 2015 or whenever this was, I really would buy this Coca-Cola, but they did not turn their brand rainbow-colored for this month. So I'm not going to buy a Coca-Cola. And it didn't start eating into their profits because it didn't happen. Instead, what we've seen is NGOs and state governments, Europe, the United States, and other countries, impose this stuff by one way or another, either by offering a reward or by penalizing them. So this is why this managerialist system that has basically told the state, told academia, and told firms that the government and NGOs can manage their companies for the better, and that profit doesn't matter, and we can take away the sting of turning a loss for these major companies. They've told them this, and this is why we have to deal with all these leftward advances in private business, is this managerial system. So,
yeah, I just wanted to drop in that Charles Haywood episode that we were going to mention, which is that we discussed that one of the effects of managerialism is the expansion of staff beyond what is really would rationally be done in the free market, because you'll have staff that is there for diversity initiatives and that's sort of the obvious stuff, but there's more than that. Charles Haywood argued in this episode here. I'll drop it right now, putting the link in the live chat. He argued that there's lots of people in a modern corporation that wouldn't really be needed if you were just producing your product efficiently for the market. He argued that easily 50 to 80% of companies could be gotten rid of. And we talked about Twitter as an interesting example of that, where indeed they are 80% down from what the employment at Twitter was before Elon Musk took over. And I hear complaints, but it works. It still works fine. And they're even adding features, which I hadn't seen them add features for years. It was really interesting to watch. I think we talked about this a little last week. It was really interesting to watch the different predictions. So Charles Haywood, I think, is ending up looking right on this, because he was saying Elon Musk can get rid of a lot of staff and still run Twitter well, probably better, because a lot of staff are a drag on productivity. They're a net negative on productivity. They're not a net positive. Okay. Other people, left-wingers, mostly mainstream center-left types and stuff said, oh, this is a disaster. He got rid of a lot of essential people, and now Twitter is going to be terrible because it doesn't have all these staff doing these really essential things. Charles Haywood's bet was the exact opposite. I know that a bunch of those people were doing useless things. They were actually a drag on Twitter. And if anything, Twitter will perform better with less staff, which is surprising and counterintuitive, but much easier to understand from this managerialist perspective, where the goal is not to build profit, it's to build managerial kingdoms, right?
Right, or be a managerial arm of a larger entity, which would be this sort of public-private partnership that we've seen rise since the 20th century started.
Right.
So, and that, you kind of just spoiled the reason that I wrote this paper and the modern application for it, but we'll get there in like 2 seconds, because there's like two more things to talk about, really major implications. There's the classic free market issue here, and that if only the most managerial of corporations will receive these subsidies, and their enemies will get the penalties and all this other stuff to keep them artificially afloat, then you're going to weed out, natural competitors, people that would naturally arise on the free and open market. And instead, you're going to have the state picking and choosing who gets to do business and who doesn't. When the state is very hostile towards the majority of the population, that is not a good thing. Classic free market talking point, I'm sure everyone's sick to death of hearing it. Managerialism explains how exactly it's being done in the broadest sense. So this isn't one agency is doing it and you just keep going down the list of agencies showing how they're doing it. This managerial philosophy shows that they are doing it in every facet of the government's authority, imagined or written. So that's something important here. This managerial idea is really key to sort of updating that free market talking point about, well, the state's picking and choosing winners and losers, to which conservatives, traditionalists, left-wingers, and all these other people would say, good, we want the correct side to win. Managerialism is explaining exactly how you're probably not going to get what you want regardless of who's being pandered to, because it's just managerialism. You're just going to be managed, you're going to have these managerial philosophies shoved down your throat, and the it's the authority of the state and the NGOs that's determining what's going to happen. So none of the right wingers are ever going to be pleased with this. But even then, as you can see by a lot of the people on the left, the more dissident side, regardless of how genuine they aren't really happy with the managerial state either. They think it stopped just short of utopia in some cases, and then in other cases they think it stopped just short of the proper amount of welfare. So this doesn't make anyone happy except the people in power. It doesn't matter because the people in power do not get their power from people being happy. So, this is that's your populist delusion 101 right there. If you want some sort of a footnote. And then the other thing here is that it really explains why the World Economic Forum and all of its different appendages and everything just sort of turned managerial and whatnot else. It didn't come out of the blue. This has been cooking up since at least the 30s, if not longer. So, whenever you look in 2016 and 17, 2015 and 14, and suddenly all these companies just went woke, and whatever else you want to call them, whenever you look at, 2000 and, was it 2009 or 2010, whenever the Obama administration nationalized the different motor companies, you see a lot of...
was this like the too big to fail?
Right, but it was extending the response supposedly to the financial crisis to other industries. So whenever you look at stuff like that, it didn't just come out of the blue. That was the perfect opportunity for a managerialist ideology in government to exert its influence onto the automotive industry. And then suddenly you look at the modern day, and these Ford and whatever else really likes the Pride movement. So this managerial concept here that we put into the Austrian framework. It was good on its own when Burnham was just making predictions, and we look back and say, oh, wow, that's come true. Look at how terrible things are still going. We can now make our own predictions. It's timeless, if you will. So we can derive what managerialism is, looking at these definitions and saying what happens if you just don't fire the manager. Well, they're going to put political and social causes as number one. What if they're propped up by different organizations? Well, they're going to keep going. Competition is going to be rooted out. Your country is going to go in whatever direction the managers want it to go. Society, economy, politics, all of it. And that's just what's going to happen. But you have two things here. And we'll start with a minor objection that I didn't anticipate, but I thought that was really good feedback. And it was one of my friends gave me feedback to this paper whenever I presented it, and he said, well, you'll have hostile takeovers, and you can liquidate the management and all this other stuff all the time. Get rid of people that you didn't want in whatever you just acquired. And surely this should put a stop to it, because now you've fired the manager, so according to your theory, everything should go back to normal. Except this, what you would then take into account is, well, who are you putting back in place? It's going to be the same exact ideology, the same exact philosophy, habit of thinking, the thing that Burnham was talking about earlier. It's just now under your company, and maybe they're slightly better for what you want. All right, you're still managerial. The entrepreneur has not.
I think it's worth calling out the uniformity of the managerial folks, right?
Right.
Which you've been kind of hinting at, but I felt like it really came through with the lockdowns. The official response to COVID. Some of the measures taken were pretty loony, frankly. I think we're all going to laugh someday. But what struck me was how lockstep managers were across government, business, nonprofits, churches, et cetera, et cetera. They all were like, yep, this is what we do. And if you don't do it, we will crush you. And this just cut across all these institutions that in the past we would have thought of as providing some counterbalance to each other. But with the reign of managerialism, they just all sing from the same hymn sheet, right?
Right, exactly. And but there's something bigger here as well. Even if you sack these managers as like a higher manager or whatever, the entrepreneur still isn't reasserting his prerogative. He's not running the company anymore because of a takeover or a merger or whatever else. So I actually thought that was really interesting, and I've incorporated it into the paper. But it seems like that would be a good refutation to begin with, but when you take into account the whole spectrum that we've discussed here, what is managerialism and why is it caused, you haven't really solved it because the entrepreneur is not active anymore. You just get the same uniform managerialism that we see every day now. And then here's the other thing. How would you get rid of managerialism? Say that you don't like the system and you want to get rid of it. Well, the market still functions. Like, it's not like it's an institution and only after you have these laws or prerequisites will you be able to make profit as a company anymore. It's not how it works. The market is just people exchanging money for goods in any situation. That's why you can have black markets in places where the market is officially illegal. It doesn't go away. So what happens if a company just does away with this unprofitable managerialism and seeks profit again? Well, as we saw with Elon Musk gutting who knows how much of the staff of Twitter and actually trying to make it turn a profit for the first time in, what was it, years? You're going to see other companies follow suit. Because it turns out, in spite of all this support, monetary and otherwise, that these managerial companies get, most people would like to just be turning a profit on their own. And they might have a delusion that they can then go to the managerialism again once they start turning a profit. They'll just refail and eventually will learn the lesson. But there is a lot of profit to be made by not being managerial and just offering things on the market that people want by the very nature that people want it. So the whole point that I wrote this paper was because we saw Elon Musk, an entrepreneur, buy a company, have his own manager still, but he reasserted his prerogative. He was in control of Twitter. And he still probably is, though to a lesser extent. But there's no doubt, considering that he'll show up on Twitter sometimes and say, yeah, Twitter made a mistake here, we'll redo something or whatever. He is still in control. He is exerting his prerogative. He is the anti-managerial entrepreneur, if you want to look at it that way. A counter-revolutionary to the managerial revolution. So he was doing that, and then I don't think it's any coincidence, though I'm sure there were other factors that played into it, that months afterwards you saw all of these tech companies starting to downsize. That was big in the news a few months ago. You saw, what was it, Windows? Microsoft was downsizing a lot of their staff. Google was as well.
A whole bunch of them, Amazon, etc. Right. And we've covered it in more depth on Econ Minis. Last week, Black Horse and I gave an update on about the last 6 months of layoffs because they have continued in really large numbers.
Right. So they would, and this is the simple fact here. If you are making money for a corporation and they do corporation things like lay off employees and whatnot because the cost is actually getting to be too much, if you generate value, you're not going to be laid off. They can't do that because that would just hurt the business itself. If they do that, the whole business is just going down anyways. It doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be laid off because the business is shutting down. The fact that all of these companies could have record amounts of layoffs in, a decade, 2 decades or so, I forget what the last benchmark was that I saw compared to. These people were not producing value for what they were being paid. Which means, I would, this is just an intuition on my part, I would say most of this probably came from the fact that Musk could just go into a tech company, gut a super majority of the staff, and then try to start turning a profit. All of these other tech companies, they might be still managerial, woke, paused, whatever you want to say. But they are starting to act more entrepreneurial, which is a good thing. That means they are going to start, if they are looking at their costs and getting rid of people who aren't contributing value, they're inching ever so closer to providing things that people want, which is what you want of a company. Regardless of where you are on the right, having a company that provides value to people is infinitely better than a company that provides subversion to people.
So, right. And I just wanted to drop this in somewhere, which is that I think part of a clue to how it is that they kept going with, 80% more staff than they could really needed, and doing all these things that were not really related to their core business, and why suddenly we might be seeing a correction, a counter revolution against the managerial revolution. Being an Austrian, I have to bring it up. There's the expansion of the money supply, which has been going like gangbusters for years. But just recently, they've been raising interest rates, which causes companies to start to be a little more conservative in their behavior when the interest rates rise, right? Because what Austrians point to is that when the in the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve pushes the interest rate below its natural rate, then it creates the illusion that you can do a lot more spending and borrowing than really makes sense. And that illusion is going away right now because of rising interest rates. And so that might, I haven't tried to completely connect the dots, but that might explain a little bit of suddenly the tech companies. Two waves. We've gone through this on Econ Minis with Black Horse, but the first wave was just the lockdowns ended. People started going back to normal life. Some of the tech companies that had benefited from everybody being stuck at home, a company like Amazon, for instance, everybody just had everything shipped to them, right? So Amazon's business really grew like crazy. They hired a lot of people and so forth. Well, the lockdowns ended and they got rid of some people because of that. That was sort of the first wave, but that was like a year ago by now. So that's why this update last week was really interesting, that in the last half year, having already done those sort of post-lockdown adjustments, now there's another round of layoffs. And that seems to fit maybe more that Charles Haywood thesis that we discussed with him, that they looked at what Elon Musk did at Twitter and they're like, okay, we probably do have more people than we really need.
Well, yeah, and so that was the impetus of the paper, trying to explain what on earth is happening. Because if you were to just look at the business climate and use very sort of conventional wisdom, you would not have arrived at the same conclusions that Charles Haywood and Black Horse did a few months ago. In fact, this was entirely unpredictable. One might even say that we live in uncertainty. That this conventional wisdom that is often put out of modern business is not so certain as they say it is, just because they're used to everything being managerial, and then suddenly we didn't have a managerial takeover of a company, we had an entrepreneurial takeover of a company. Entrepreneurial just meaning normal. This is how it's supposed to happen. So that's all that I think that I really have at this point in time. Just one last thing.
We had one thing, which is that after slagging off managers the whole show, we were just going to bring in one other angle, which is that as Ryan has tried to emphasize here, we're not saying managers have no role. We're just saying that we've seen a long run trend because of the state intervention of there being out of balance. Right, more manager direction and less entrepreneurial direction than there ought to be in a an economy where consumer desires are really in charge as opposed to the state, right? So there is a place for managers, and in fact, Peter Klein and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the other author, our friend Peter Klein. He has written a book addressing this. Nikolai, his usual co-author, Nikolai Foss and Peter Klein. They are very aware of everything we've said. They're both Austrian economists, I believe. And so they nevertheless, they wrote a book, Why Managers Matter, The Perils of the Bossless Company. What they're talking about here is not too much entrepreneurialism. What they're talking about here is a different phenomenon, which is, as they put it in the marketing, the idea that every company has a startup culture where there's no hierarchies, there's no bosses. It's sort of egalitarian utopia within a firm, right? And that's really what they're pushing against here. Let me, I'll share this with you. Let's see, Why Managers Matter.
And just so that people understand, one of the prime examples of this is is Valve, the software and video games company. because their policy for the longest time, and maybe still, was that they really valued the creative direction of their programmers and artists and designers and whatever else. So they weren't going to manage everyone into telling them we have to focus on this project even if you don't want to. They wanted to get the best out of everyone, so they were going to let them be very creative, and you just show up to work and work on what you want to, so long as you're working. And the company is going to be... Now, they haven't exactly failed. The fact that they have failed then means if there's a better way to do it, then they left money on the table, which is always the other side. If you have a business or a company doing something wrong and they're still making a profit, it doesn't mean that you're wrong necessarily in saying they've done something wrong. It means that if you are right, they've just left money on the table, which is a bad business decision. So that's one of the examples of a managerless company here. No one has any sort of organization, which, as we were pointing out throughout this, if you want to be the best on the market, you're going to have to organize people somehow, which would necessitate a manager.
Yeah, and always, just as with people predicting the decline, the fall of the U.S. empire every day, similarly with these big companies, you got to recognize that it takes a little while for the rot to manifest, right? Valve, I'm not a video game guy, but I gather Valve had some really big hits early on as a video game company, right?
Right, yeah. Half-Life, Team Fortress, was it CSGO Valve? I think so. Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, early on, probably when they were not trying to make their company an egalitarian political experiment or whatever, they probably had some driving creative visionaries. They created some great work. And then, in a way, it's like I can't judge. We talked about psychic profit. If it's your company and you want to use it to do a little social experiment, and it means that you don't make as much money or you stop making money, well, it's your prerogative, right? But you may not be able to keep your firm going for very long. Eventually, that sort of thing is going to eat into your ability to be an effective company, to be a profitable company, and eventually it'll die. It'll take some time because, as we know, with some of these companies that have hits, like a video game company, for example, they have a hit, they make just a ton of money, and they literally can live off of that money for some time. And the original hits are continuing to bring in income because people continue to enjoy Half-Life or whatever, right? And so the whole thing can keep going for a while, even as they're doing things that, in retrospect, seem wildly inefficient. They can get away with it for a while. So don't be like Valve will collapse tomorrow. More like, will Valve be around in its current form in 10 years or 15 years? That's where I think, that's the kind of time horizon for a company.
Right. And it's also, I would also say, don't bet on any of these companies maintaining managerialism for very long if entrepreneurs keep asserting their control like Elon Musk, because it is very clearly a superior way to run a company. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to force these managerial types to either dispense with any facades they have and just go fully under a more direct managerial system like you would find in the Russian style, or it's going to necessitate them giving it up, because it's very difficult to keep this to keep saying that we have a liberal democracy after the New Deal, if they just have to, all the state does is fund all of these companies in the private sector, or NGOs have to keep doing it, which are themselves usually supported by the state, to make sure that they stay afloat and keep pushing one social message across all companies. Their legitimacy is going to fade, and regardless of something about the populism and all this other stuff, is that you do still need legitimacy if you are to rule. So entrepreneurs asserting themselves over managerial systems is actually a threat to the current government, which is managerial. They cannot have a threat to their legitimacy, because that's just how states operate. That's how ruling classes operate. They have to be legitimate. If no one believes in their authority, then they don't have authority. Is you can only result on shooting people until they do what you say for so long, until a more legitimate and a better organized ruling class just takes their power. Yeah, so that's something about how this can snowball.
Yeah, just some input from folks on Valve. TB88 says Valve doesn't really make games anymore. I don't know how to say that name. SMNAODRT says last Valve new releases I recall were Dota spin-offs, the card game, and Auto Chess one. Both were complete flops. Yeah, what's Dota? We have someone in our circles who's huge on that.
Just not for now. We will. It's a video game. It can. I know how I would describe it, but I know we're going to start some sort of war if I'd call it that. I would.
Just tell me what it stands for.
I don't remember what it stands for. I just know what it is, and I think I have a
Defense of the Ancients.
Yeah, that's it.
Defense of the Ancients. Oh, that's different than what I was thinking.
Right.
Okay.
The way that I describe it to people that don't know is I will typically say that it's Valve's version of League of Legends, which is itself. I don't like either.
Yeah.
So.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So now we'll wait for the comments to come in saying how I'm terribly wrong.
Right, and Dave says Valve makes insane amount of money. Yeah, and they like I said, they'll probably coast for a while on some of those old things, but eventually, it'll catch up with them. So, okay, I wanted to highlight one. Let's see here. Make sure I'm not missing anything. Yes. Oh, just Sam153, very generous donation at Subscribestar, where they take less of your money than, and it doesn't go to Google. In sending, they're called tips, but it's like super chats. He says, "Cheers to Mr. Turnipseed. All the best on his LCMS endeavors." And if you're interested in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which historically known for being a theologically conservative denomination, and Ryan's encounters with them, then let's see, what is that? Well, Ryan's Twitter, I guess, is where the main action has been. You should really put that stuff on Substack so it's easier to send people to it.
I can probably do that. I just maybe I can ask the
archive
club
as an archive of the key threads.
Right. So,
and there's really two main threads that people need to see, I think.
Yeah, right, but if you want to see it, it's both or everything's linked in the thread. So if you want to see it, it's pinned on my profile at Turnip Merchant on Twitter.
There you go. Yeah, didn't think of that.
Yeah, it's the first pinned thing, and then that links to the original thread, and there's a bunch of other things added to it. So, yeah, that's
I'll just share. I'll share that. Yeah, if you haven't heard about any of this, even for people outside the LCMS like myself, you'll be surprised how interesting it is, shall we say. But anyway, thanks for that, Sam153. Okay, so I think we are done. Thank you very much, Ryan, for sharing not only what you've been learning, but then some original work you did and presented at the Mises Institute this spring. And then you'll be back there, as well as my daughter will be there as well for Mises University, which Tom Woods calls the best week of the year. It must be pretty good since you're going back again, Ryan.
Yeah. Well, I have to win the verbal examination. I only placed last year. I didn't become number one.
Okay, the Grundlich, Profund Grundlich. I don't remember the German, but anyway, that thing, right?
Yeah, and I was specifically told all of my answers were great. I just did not answer as many as I could have. So this next time I have to talk more tersely and faster.
Oh, like you ran out of time, basically?
So you get as many questions as you have time for. So if your answers are too long and verbose, like I tend to be,
you don't get through enough questions. I see.
And that's part of they grade you based off of how good are the answers and how many did you answer.
Got it. Okay.
So
you got to move faster.
Right. So I want number one. That's just
cut to the chase. Yeah. I didn't try to play. I don't think I had any chance of placing or anything, but I did pass one of those for graduate seminar, I think. It wasn't Mises
Right.
U, because they didn't have that back when I did Mises U, but I did pass. So I mention it because anyone who's been through those knows that it is hard. It's not simple. To even to pass is an accomplishment.
And they really make you think. I remember on the
Yeah.
multiple choice ones, I asked like, "Is this really the answer?" And I think I forget who I asked, but I was told, "Well, most Austrians would say yes, but some would say no." And I was like, "Ah, it's one of those questions."
Oh dear.
But yeah, it's fun. And then immediately the next week, I will have to be in Delaware, like a day after Mises U, because that is the ISI Honors Conference, which is
Yeah.
Bill Buckley's institution, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. I was recommended to attend there this summer, and there's a few other people going to Mises U who are going to be making the trip as well. So
Oh really?
quite
Oh,
an
okay.
interesting bit of overlap. I have a lot of traveling to do this summer.
I prefer to think of it as Dan McCarthy's thing now that he's over at ISI.
That is a much better way to
But-
look at it.
But he doesn't have anything to do with your particular thing, as far as I know. He just edits their Modern Age, which is the venerable journal that has had a lot of important
Right.
debates over the years in it.
And,
But anyway,
before we sign off, it might be worth
Yeah.
mentioning we have an event coming up in a few
yes,
weeks.
thank you. Oh, thank you. I'll pull up the link. Talk.
We have an event coming up in a few weeks. It is going to be, I don't know, is it similar to last year's? I don't know if that's a bad connotation or not. Last year's went swimmingly. So
It was
we have
great.
we had R.R. McIntyre, you, and a bunch of other new people speaking this year. Bagby, if you've come across him in our circles, he's a great individual. Grant Brooks is going to be speaking as well. He has written for the Old Glory Club. He is in the club now. We have a lot of OGC people, a lot of people that we know here. Let me see. Charlemagne's speaking again. A lot of other great people. And then more people who aren't speaking are going to be there. Definitely worth your time. It was probably the highlight of last year. Definitely in the top 3 for me. I would absolutely encourage, if you have the means and ability to do so, to attend this year. I'm not speaking. I will be there. It will be an absolute blast. Stephen, I'm sure there's a lot you would want to say.
Yeah, I shared the link. I also did a talk. You know what? I better find that. That would be the Skildings channel, right?
Yeah, they released my talk on their YouTube channel as well, like last week or something. Maybe.
Right. No, I'm talking about an interview where
Ah.
I'm promoting the coming to this event. I say a lot more here. A sec to drop that as well. I've put the live chat now has a link that says buy tickets now and points to it. It is just a couple weeks away. It is a little expensive, so I think that's why I wanted to drop that interview with me talking about why you might want to go, because I could see you being a little like, whoa, do I really want to do this? And I hope to give you the reasons why you might want to go in that interview. And one of them I'll just say real quick, which is just that for me, going from knowing a lot of folks online to meeting people in person was a big difference. It really helped. It didn't mean that like people weren't who I thought they were. That's not what I mean. Getting together in person with a lot of like-minded people, the atmosphere was really positive, really constructive, and encouraging. So it's the kind of thing that you would, I think you would be surprised how glad you were you went. So anyway, I recommend my, what is it? They talked to me for about 26 minutes about what I give a teaser about what I'm planning to talk about, but mostly I talk about how great it was to go to the US event last year. I went to the UK event last fall, and just the effect on me, the effect on my thinking of being part of these events.
And at the very least, you can let the results speak for themselves. Skildings released my presentation from last year that I gave at the event. And I had a few people message me and they said, this sounds very similar to the Old Glory Club. And I don't think that's exactly an accident. There was a lot of discussion that came out of last year's event that culminated in the Old Glory Club. And in fact, if you look at the original members list, A lot of us met each other for the first time at this event last year. So
That's right.
there's a lot of great things that come out of it, and there's a lot more that's going to come out of it as well. I'm absolutely certain of. So,
Yep.
you know,
Absolutely.
last year was like the ground floor if you wanted to be in on something like the Old Glory Club. Who knows what's going to happen this year? So,
Here's Son of Haster. He says, "Can't wait to see you at the event. I'm in a party of 4 from my area, all going. That is awesome. Really look forward to seeing you." Yeah, it is so great to meet folks and you know, get behind the pseudonyms and the abstraction of people being as disembodied online people and meet people in person. It really is tremendous. Okay, thanks, Ryan, for helping me remember. It should have been on me to remember that, but you did great by bringing that up. Absolutely want to get everybody to that event who can make it, and also it's not going to be at the same place as last time, but I assume it's going to be similar in that it was a really enjoyable place to be. I remember enjoying the setting. It was really nice. I remember going on a walk with some of the folks, my wife and some of the folks. And by the way, if that's a draw for some people, I am planning to attend with my wife this year again. So if you enjoy the Mrs. Radlib series and would like to meet,
you can get a great deal of advice. Very useful advice.
Right. And she's just fun. She really is. Okay. So, all right. Thank you, Ryan. And I believe we should be on for next week with Econ Minis with Black Horse. We've been kind of bouncing around a little bit. We aren't pure current events right now, just because the current events there hasn't been as much news. So we started on talking about mutual aid, a history of mutual aid in the United States and what happened to it. The mutual aid that we used to have and how did that change. So that's a series I'm personally very excited about, something that connects a lot to what we're up to with the Old Glory Club, for example. And then we do spend at least a few minutes at the beginning touching on any current topics in the world of economics and so forth. And as usual, Black Horse has a stellar track record since we started doing this together of having good calls on what's going on and what we expect to happen next. So if you like that, if you like being clued in to the world and how things work and what'll happen next, you might enjoy our show. Okay, so hope to see some of you next week. Thanks very much. Thanks, Ryan, and goodbye.